An open letter to Doug Ford. Mr. Ford, you've been Premier of Ontario for a few years now. I didn't vote for you. I was not particularly happy when you became Premier, because I knew that your values didn't align with mine. None of the options that were on offer really did, but yours were likely the least congruent of the major candidates. But I digress. I watched over the years as you've weakened environmental legislation, as you've attempted to privatize and undermine our public healthcare system, as you've just generally mismanaged the economy, favoring those of extreme wealth over those with moderate or mediocre wealth. You've not done a particularly great job of managing the province, but you've also not been horrible. I would give you not great ratings, but I don't think you're the worst premier we've ever had. Yet. When the pandemic came along, I didn't have particularly high hopes. I knew the type of manager that you would be of something like this, and so the bar was set low throughout. You exceeded that goal. You exceeded my exceedingly low expectations. You did better than Donald Trump, for example. At least you acknowledged that a pandemic was happening. You acknowledged some of the public health guidances, such as mask wearing. You even instituted some lockdown orders, which was a pleasant surprise. The early pandemic infection rates were well handled by these techniques, basically by keeping people home, by subsidizing businesses to keep closed. We've been able to save a lot of lives. But as the pandemic has worn on, your performance has gotten worse and worse. When the color-coded system for pandemic restrictions came into effect, I had some fairly high hopes, but as I looked a little further into them, these restrictions were a little bit lackluster. Some of the more high-risk activities were precluded a little bit further up that scale than I would have liked, and even the gray lockdown scale was not particularly restrictive in terms of what it is that we're doing. Mind you, it seemed to be relatively effective. We did impose the restrictions at the appropriate level, sometimes a little bit after when it would have been appropriate. But as the second wave started to rise, I started losing a bit of faith. Still, nothing was substantively being done, and yet rates continued to rise. It wasn't until the day after Christmas that we actually imposed a province-wide lockdown, well after public health officials had recommended such a thing, and certainly well after it would have been most effective. But of course, we had to get our Christmas shopping done, and we really wanted to see people for Christmas. You know, have as many super spreader events as possible before doing the lockdown. And I get it. I mean, you were being pressured. You were being pressured by big business and small business because they're losing a lot of money by having these restrictions in place. The folks that make money by having customers aren't making as much money as they could be, and so they're pressuring you for everything possible to ease these restrictions so they can get back to making money. And of course, even the people themselves don't like the restrictions. Nobody really wants to be trapped at home. Nobody wants to be stuck not being able to see their friends or go shopping or do any of the things that they enjoy. I don't like it, certainly don't, but on the other hand, people are dying because of these things. We kind of need to make certain sacrifices in order to save people's lives. But thankfully we did do the lockdown, and it worked. We can see on the graph it went sharply downwards as soon as the lockdown measures were put in place. This is how pandemics operate. If we eliminate the possibility for the pandemic to spread, the pandemic eventually dies out. Everything was going great. And then we lifted the lockdown too early. I've spoken before about this, how when you're imposing measures to control the spread of a virus, it is incredibly unwise to lift these measures even a little bit too early. It's like how the doctor tells you don't stop taking your antibiotics until the prescription is done. The reason for that is that if you stop the measures necessary to control the disease before they're done, the disease is still there, and then it can resurge. And oftentimes, in the case of bacteria for antibiotics, there's a chance of building antibiotic resistance. And in this case of the virus, the rate of mutation of an RNA virus like COVID increases the possibility of variants emerging. We already have a few variants of concern that are way more virulent than the original virus. And the more infections we have, the more chance that there's going to be another variant emerging. So we want to be doing everything in our possible power to prevent more infections. Absolutely everything. But we're not really doing that now, are we? And so, as it should be of no surprise to absolutely anybody, including you, Doug, as soon as the lockdown restrictions were taken out, infection rates started to rise again. We're now looking at a third wave which was unnecessary. Had we kept the restrictions in place for a couple of weeks longer, we wouldn't be in this position, but here we are. If we take action now, though, if we impose more strict lockdown procedures at this very moment, if not last week, we'd probably be able to weather it relatively well. If we went into gray lockdown zone for most of the province, especially the most hardest hit parts of the province, well, we'd probably make it. We'd probably be all right. Oh, but wait. It looks like gray lockdown isn't actually lockdown anymore. So last week you made it so that outdoor dining was possible, even in gray lockdown mode. I don't know if you don't know what the definition of lockdown is, but that's not it. Lockdown would imply that we're actually locked down, where there's, no unnecessary commerce occurring, where people are encouraged as much as possible to be away from one another, i.e. not sitting on a patio with one another. And now, of course, this week you're intending on lifting the restrictions on gyms and other high-risk, I might add, activities. Why you would be lifting that restriction on a lockdown, I am not quite sure. I assume it must be because you're being pressured by the industry to loosen up these restrictions. And yes, the people who are so self-entitled that they're not willing to sacrifice their morning workout routine just to be able to save a couple of measly lives. I understand the nature of this pressure, I understand the causes, and I understand how pressuring it must be. You've got a lot of friends who are quite wealthy and a lot of people who want you to lift all these restrictions altogether. But the thing is, people are going to die. People are definitely going to die as a direct result of these measures, as a direct result of your decision not to actually have lockdowns anymore. And yeah, I kind of predict that you'll likely go with another province-wide lockdown after Easter, of course after the super spreader events of Easter take place. But the problem with that is, it sucks. Nobody likes stay-at-home orders. Nobody likes being unable to shop for anything. Instead of doing that, we could have had more reasonable restrictions in place all throughout. We could have prevented the situation that requires a complete stay-at-home order in the first place. But instead of doing that, we've taken this weird compromisey middle ground, which does no good for anybody. Ends up with us in a lockdown one way or the other. We end up with another stay-at-home order when it wouldn't have been necessary in the first place. People will die who wouldn't have died otherwise had we just made slightly better choices all along. And I don't mean us as individuals necessarily, although yes, that is part of the equation. But a lot of these things do have to come from on top. Now, I'm an anarchist. I don't really believe in unjust authority or the exercise of power unjustly. But in this case, well, sometimes you gotta exercise power in order to get things done. And yes, in the case of a pandemic, in case of saving people's fucking lives, sometimes you gotta do something other than what your constituents want you to do. Because sometimes your constituents, particularly the rich ones, particularly the entitled ones, particularly the ones that have given you all your campaign contributions, they don't have our best interests in mind. So, Doug, I respect the position that you're in. I respect the fact that you've got a difficult job to do, and I respect the fact that you're doing your best. But you really gotta think this through better. You gotta listen to your public health professionals. They're all screaming at you to do more, and yet you're doing less. Could you please listen to reason? Could you please do what's right for all of us? Could you save the lives that are going to end because of your mismanagement of this? Thanks for your consideration. Signed, Eric, and probably the rest of the province too. You! Anyway, I make videos daily, and so if you like this content, like it, share it, whatever, maybe you'll even get to Doug Ford's office. And if you like this content, check out some of those videos. Maybe you might like them too. And so thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.